She gave birth in a prison cell. Real stories of babies born behind bars. The walls of a prison are meant to confine guilt, not cradle new life. Yet sometimes, behind those cold metal doors, a faint cry breaks through the silence. The cry of a baby who never chose this beginning. In a place where freedom is forbidden, innocence takes its first breath. This is the story of life born in chains, of two women whose motherhood unfolded inside cells meant for punishment. It's a story of pain, neglect, resilience, and hope, where the smallest heartbeat exposes the system's coldest truth, that life doesn't wait for mercy to arrive. The cell of silence. The night was heavy and airless, pressing against the concrete walls like a weight. Maya sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands trembling as another contraction tore through her. She had been counting them for hours, trying to convince herself that this wasn't it, that the baby could wait until morning, until help could arrive. But deep down she knew. The time had come. She pressed the call button above her bed, her thumb shaking. A faint click followed, then silence. She pressed again. Nothing. Somewhere down the hall, a door clanged shut and footsteps echoed away. Maya whispered into the darkness, "Please, someone," but her voice vanished into the walls. At 18 she was already used to being invisible. Growing up in foster homes, shuffled from one temporary life to another, she had learned that silence was both her shield and her prison. Her teenage years were marked by rebellion, shoplifting, running away, small-time trouble that grew into serious mistakes. When she was arrested, she was already carrying a secret, a baby she hadn't meant to have but couldn't bring herself to abandon. In prison, time moved differently. The days were loud, the nights endless. The other women had their own stories, their own pain, but pregnancy made Maya an outsider among outsiders. Guards watched her with suspicion. Social workers visited her cell, speaking in tones that sounded like judgment dressed as concern. Every conversation ended with the same quiet threat, that her baby might be taken away as soon as it was born. The fear consumed her more than the confinement did. When the contractions began that night, they were mild, like whispers. She tried to sleep. But soon the whispers turned to screams echoing inside her body. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, trying not to cry out, because she knew no one was coming. She pressed the call button again, harder this time. "Please," she muttered, her voice hoarse. Somewhere a light flickered. But no one came. The cell grew smaller with each contraction. She crouched on the floor, clutching her stomach, the concrete freezing against her knees. Sweat and fear mingled on her skin. The baby was coming faster now, the pressure unbearable. She screamed once, then covered her mouth as if ashamed of the sound. Minutes turned to hours. When the pain reached its peak, her body took over. Instinct replaced fear. She lay back against the cold floor, the thin blanket beneath her soaked with sweat. Her breathing turned to shallow gasps. She pushed, crying out for help that never came. And then, amid the agony, the silence broke. A single, fragile cry filled the room. Her baby had arrived. Maya stared in disbelief. She had no doctor, no nurse, no one. Just the flickering hallway light bleeding through the narrow slit of her door. She reached down and lifted the tiny body to her chest, trembling. The baby's skin was bluish, slick with birth. She bit through the cord with shaking teeth, then pressed the baby close, whispering words she didn't even understand. "You're here. You're here." She didn't know how long she sat there, cradling her newborn. The world outside her cell didn't change. The guards walked their rounds. Keys jingled. Metal clanked. No one came. By dawn, exhaustion pulled her under. The baby had stopped crying. When the cell door finally opened hours later, the morning light revealed a horror that no one wanted to see. Blood covered the floor. The young mother sat slumped against the wall, pale and motionless, her eyes fixed on the tiny, lifeless bundle in her arms. A scream tore from the guard's throat. Alarms followed. But it was too late. Maya's baby, a girl she had wanted to name Hope, had been born and died within the same four walls. The investigation that followed painted a portrait of systematic failure. The prison had ignored her pleas for medical help. The nurses had gone off duty. The emergency call system had malfunctioned. On paper there were procedures, detailed, bureaucratic promises of care for pregnant inmates. But in reality, those words lived only in policy manuals, not in practice. 4 days Maya was kept in isolation. Officials said it was for her protection, but the silence of that room nearly destroyed her. She replayed the night over and over, the unanswered calls, the cries fading into stillness, the moment she realized she was completely, utterly alone. When the press later reported the story, the country reacted with outrage. Editorials called it a national disgrace. Activists demanded reform. Politicians expressed shock that such a tragedy could happen in a modern prison system. Yet for Maya these reactions meant nothing. No outcry could bring her baby back. Weeks passed. Her body healed, but her mind didn't. She carried the memory of that night like a scar that refused to fade. Every sound in the prison, the slamming of doors, the distant cries, reminded her of that moment when she became a mother and a mourner in the same breath. Eventually, a coroner's report detailed what she already knew: the system had failed her. Warnings had been ignored. Medical staff had missed critical signs. A young woman had begged for help and no one had listened. They called it a tragedy. She called it her life. Years later, Maya was released. The world outside felt larger than she remembered, and yet somehow emptier. Reporters tried to find her, but she disappeared quietly into the world, another forgotten name in the endless cycle of headlines. Some say she found peace in a women's shelter, that she started volunteering for mothers in crisis. Others say she never recovered, that the trauma followed her like a shadow. What is known is this: Maya's story changed something. After her case, new protocols were introduced. Specialized mother and baby units were funded. Pregnant inmates received better monitoring and faster emergency access. Posters appeared in prison corridors, urging staff to listen, act, protect. But for every new policy, there remained an unspoken truth. No amount of paperwork could erase the image of a young woman giving birth alone in a locked cell. Behind every statistic is a heartbeat, and behind every reform is a ghost. In the years that followed, hundreds of babies were safely delivered behind bars, their first cries met with midwives and care rather than silence. But Maya's story lingered, whispered among prison staff, shared in training sessions, retold by inmates who saw in her story both horror and hope. Because sometimes, it takes one tragedy to force a system to see the humanity it has long ignored. And sometimes, the smallest life can expose the greatest failures. Maya never spoke publicly about that night. But in her silence, her baby's name, Hope, lived on as a reminder that even in the darkest place, light can still try to be born. The miracle through the vent. The world had already forgotten about Maya's tragedy when another story began unfolding thousands of miles away. This time, the story didn't begin with silence. It began with whispers, absurd, almost impossible whispers about a miracle conceived through walls and vents, between two souls separated by steel. In a correctional facility in Florida, 2 inmates lived in neighboring isolation cells. They were strangers at first, separated by a corridor and the heavy air of punishment. But confinement has a way of bending time, of stretching loneliness into something desperate and human. In that loneliness they found each other, not through touch, not through sight, but through the narrow vents that connected their worlds. One of them, Lena, was 29, quiet, intense, and defiant. She had been in isolation for months, her mind fraying at the edges. The other, Jordan, was 24, young, reckless, his laughter often echoing down the vents late at night. They spoke through the metal grates for hours, voices echoing like ghosts. In that mechanical hum they built something forbidden, a bond fragile but real. Every night they talked about freedom. About life beyond the bars. About what it meant to be forgotten. And somewhere between the darkness and the confessions, an idea took root, wild, impossible but filled with hope. They wanted to bring life into a place that only knew death and despair. The plan sounded ridiculous, something out of rumor or prison folklore. But isolation breeds imagination. And imagination, when mixed with longing, can become action. Using the vents, Lena and Jordan passed small notes, scraps of food, and eventually something more precious. Through sheer determination and a series of unbelievable attempts, the unthinkable happened. Lena became pregnant. No one believed her at first. The prison doctor frowned at the test results, assuming a mistake. How could a woman in solitary confinement, locked away for months, be carrying a child? Yet the evidence was irrefutable. Inside her, a heartbeat grew. When word spread, the facility went into chaos. Investigators were dispatched. Guards whispered about the vent baby. Journalists caught wind of the story, calling it a miracle, a scandal, a mystery. The administration launched an inquiry, demanding to know how 2 inmates, both accused of violent crimes, had created life inside the most controlled environment imaginable. But Lena didn't care about the questions. For the first time since her arrest, she felt purpose. In her belly, there was proof that even in confinement, something pure could exist. The months that followed were heavy with scrutiny. Every move she made was monitored, every appointment recorded. Yet, as her stomach grew, so did her resolve. She began talking to the child as if the baby could hear her through the noise, whispering promises that the world outside would be different. Kinder. For Jordan, locked away in the other block, the pregnancy became both his salvation and his torment. He couldn't see her, couldn't touch her, couldn't even hear her voice anymore. But through the vent, he whispered prayers. He carved small marks into the wall to count down the weeks, each scratch a promise to the child he might never meet. When Lena went into labor, it was June, hot, humid, the air thick with tension. Unlike Maya's story, this time there were doctors, nurses, guards. Cameras followed. The prison warden stood by as medical teams rushed her to an infirmary. The world outside had already caught wind of the story. Reporters camped outside the facility gates, hungry for headlines. But inside, amid the flashing lights and shouting voices, the miracle arrived quietly. A baby girl, small and perfect, entered the world. Her first cry broke through the sterile hum of the infirmary, soft and piercing. Everyone stopped for a moment, guards, nurses, even hardened officers who'd seen everything. There it was again, that sound. The sound of innocence where none was meant to exist. Lena looked down at her daughter and wept. In that moment, the walls disappeared. There was no prison, no crime, no past, just life. A fragile, screaming life that she had created in a place meant to crush her spirit. But miracles don't erase consequences. Within hours, child services arrived. The baby was placed into the custody of Lena's mother, a woman she hadn't spoken to in years. The warden offered condolences cloaked as protocol. The world moved on, leaving behind another headline: Inmate gives birth to miracle baby conceived through prison vent. Months passed. Lena stayed in confinement, her sentence unchanged. Jordan, still in his cell, never got to see his daughter. But for both of them, something fundamental had shifted. The baby had become a symbol of resistance, of hope, of the human instinct to create life even in the darkest circumstances. Psychologists studying the case later called it an act of unconscious rebellion. Experts debated the logistics, how it happened, if it was even possible. But beyond the science, the story became something else, a legend whispered in prison halls across the country. To the inmates, it was proof that life could defy control. To the system, it was a scandal that needed to be buried under policy memos and disciplinary reviews. To Lena, it was everything. She began writing letters to her daughter from her cell, one for every birthday she missed. She wrote about forgiveness, about strength, about how she hoped her child would never know the sound of a metal door locking behind her. And though the child grew up outside prison walls, her story followed her. People called her the miracle baby. Journalists occasionally tried to find her, to see what became of the girl who began her life between bars. But her grandmother protected her fiercely, keeping her identity private. When the girl turned 5, a photo surfaced briefly, a child running barefoot in a Florida park, sunlight in her hair. The caption beneath read simply, "Free." For Lena, still behind bars, that image was everything she needed. It was proof that her child had something she herself had lost, a life untouched by confinement. Years later, when Lena's sentence ended, she walked out of prison carrying only a box of letters and a single photograph. The world had changed. Her name was still tied to her crime, but for many she was remembered as the woman who defied the system by giving life through a vent. She spoke little about the details, but those who met her described a quiet woman, haunted yet proud. She never sought fame, never tried to sell her story. Instead, she volunteered for prison outreach programs, counseling young women who entered the system pregnant. When asked why, she would simply say, "Because I know what it means to bring light into a place that was never meant to see it." The miracle baby, now a teenager, grew up hearing only fragments of the story. Her grandmother told her that her mother was brave, that she fought for her even before she was born, that she came into this world not by accident but by sheer will. And though the girl never fully understood, she carried that truth quietly, like a hidden flame. In the end, Lena's story wasn't about scandal or science. It was about defiance, the human need to create meaning, to love, to nurture, even in places that crush the soul. Her child's birth became more than an anomaly. It became a reminder that humanity cannot be fully imprisoned. That life, however fragile, finds a way to break through even steel and concrete. And somewhere, in another cell, another woman might have heard her story and found hope in it. Because the truth, as Maya once proved and Lena reaffirmed, is that prisons can cage bodies, but never the instinct to create, to love, and to believe in tomorrow. 2 women. 2 cells. 2 children born where no child should ever draw breath. One story ended in silence, the other in a cry that carried beyond the walls, yet both revealed the same truth. Life doesn't wait for freedom. It simply demands to exist. Their stories aren't about crime or punishment, but about resilience. Proof that even behind bars humanity refuses to die. If this story moved you, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Because somewhere right now, another heartbeat is echoing in the dark, reminding us that hope survives even in chains.